this is my title. Obviously, we're in Lumiere, right in the middle of Lumiere, so it's very appropriate that we talk about light. But as opposed to actually what you're experiencing in Lumiere, which is the visible end of the spectrum, what you can see, I'm going to be talking about another part of the light spectrum and its potential as a therapeutic, okay? Something maybe you're not aware of. Okay, so this all started 20 years ago, roughly, give or take. I had a very tall South African local GP from Peterlee knocked on my door and came in and came up with a bit of a wacky idea, I thought at the time, being a very skeptical scientist. We've got a few scientists in the audience, you know what I mean. You know, we are generally skeptical about things. And he came up with this idea of potentially using infrared light, a particular wavelength of infrared light, as a therapeutic, in this case, actually to treat cold sores. Okay, so it was an antiviral approach. I might come back to that right at the end. You might guess what I might talk about at the end. So this is what he came up with, and his first question, because he was a medic, medics don't tend to know too much about biology and things like that. They come in, he asked me basically, how does this work? How could this work as a therapy? So that was my first question. A couple of years on, we just started exploring the idea and the potential of this effect. And I eventually convinced him, let's move into the brain, because some of the mechanisms that we were finding out about this therapy were very relevant to the brain. I'm a neuroscientist, so I encouraged Gordon, let's look at the brain and start exploring. And there's obvious reasons why you want to look at the brain. Alzheimer's disease, I don't really need to tell this audience, is a major and growing, Boris, a major and growing problem for everybody, basically, not just the people who suffer from Alzheimer's, their carers, friends, everybody, basically. So as to Alzheimer's disease, there's a lot of words. I mean, I don't really need to say what's on there. There's a lot of people that suffer from Alzheimer's, and that's growing. In the UK, rough estimate, 750,000, potentially creeping up to 1 million, and that will be growing. Okay, so it's a major problem. And Parkinson's disease is number 2. It's another one that I'm exploring as well for obvious reasons, which you'll hopefully see later. So major brain diseases of complex diseases, that's another thing to bear in mind. You can't tackle Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease with a single drug, single target, which is really the way we've gone so far, unfortunately. We've spent a huge amount of money wasted. You know, you might have seen a lot of press about amyloid antibody approaches. Never going to work, okay? They've already proved to be negative. We're still pushing it, unfortunately, because we're desperate. Anyway, that's enough politics. Okay, so light. Just to introduce you to light. So as I said, at the moment, we're concentrating in Lumiere around the visible range, okay? So that's the range we're looking at the moment, literally. This is the range we're talking about, infrared light, and particularly at this end of the infrared light is what we're interested in, okay? It's an unusual wavelength to study. It's actually, we had to convince a company to make the LEDs for that wavelength because people didn't really believe that wavelength was particularly useful biologically. So we had to convince them. Okay, reason why we use this wavelength. This is one very important reason. Actually, when you expose the top of the skull, this is the helmet in front of me here, I'll show you in a minute a bit more. This light wavelength actually penetrates through the skull into the brain quite deeply. You're talking about that sort of length. It's quite surprising, maybe. You think, how the heck does that work? In fact, the skull works as a lens. It actually focuses the light. I didn't know that when I first studied this wavelength. I was pretty rubbish at physics at school. I didn't really understand that principle. I assumed, okay, you had to design the light to go into the thinnest parts of the skull, but in fact, it's complete opposite. The skull was actually focusing the brain deep into the skull, into the brain. The other aspect of this wavelength, it is actually the peak transmission wavelength of water. And as your brain, 70% of your brain is water, so once it's in, it actually penetrates even deeper because it goes through water very well, or travels through water. Okay, so that's a very good reason to look at this wavelength, okay, to start with, because it needs to get in to the target, okay? So for me as a pharmacologist, understanding that, yeah, it has to get to target, otherwise it's not going to do anything. So that's the first thing, okay? So that's, right, so we're going back to Alzheimer's disease, just to take you through a little bit of what it's about. It's a little bit depressing, some of these slides, obviously, because it's a tough disease, really tricky disease. And there's lots of different processes. As I said, it's a complex disease. Lots of things happen over time as the disease progresses. Things like inflammation, you lose the neurons, the connections, they're called synapses, the connections. You lose them, and you develop proteins that you probably have heard of, things like amyloid. You may have heard amyloid protein. When you look at an Alzheimer's brain, you see these deposits of protein. That's when proteins have been misfolded, chucked out, and you get these plaques. In fact, it's a bit of a red herring. It's too late then, actually, in the disease progression. Okay, but anyway, it's a very important part of the disease pathology. Okay, so just bear that in mind. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happens in aging. You know, when you get to my age, things are starting to go a bit awry. So things like reduced battery function. So what I mean by that is in the cell, you've got an organelle called a mitochondria, and that's your battery, basically, that runs the cell. Okay? And as you age, that starts to get, starts to drain a bit, get lower and lower in terms of activity. Okay? Also, as you age, you start to lose neurons. Cells become stressed, different ways of stress. Physiologically stress, behavioral stress can cause cells to be lost for various reasons. Okay, so in an Alzheimer's brain here, you can really get a real loss of nerve cells. Okay, so bear that in mind. And within that, you've got the protein, all these horrible proteins misfolding and things like that, and that kills neurons. Other things, you get misconnections. Connections start to go awry. That's what this image is supposed to depict. You're starting to lose connections between neurons. And as I said, inflammation is a really important aspect of brain disease. Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, all the ALS, all those, inflammation is a massive problem. And it's quite often because as you age, as I said, your blood-brain barrier, that barrier that helps you protect yourself from excessive inflammation, starts to get a bit leaky, and things start to get into the brain and start to affect the brain. Okay, so inflammation is a really important facet of Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so what does the light give you? Okay, bearing in mind those complex elements that underlie the disease, and if you really want a game changer in terms of treating the disease, you need to affect all those processes simultaneously. Okay, so the first thing this treatment does, this light, and actually other wavelengths of infrared light do similar things, okay, is do this. So it produces a gas, nitric oxide, not laughing gas, similar. I often get asked that, is it laughing gas? No, it's nitrous oxide, it's slightly different. But nitric oxide is a really important gas, physiological gas, and one of its main functions is to dilate your blood vessels. So in other words, it makes them expand and more blood can flow into your brain. Okay? Again, it doesn't take too much to think about that. That's a good thing, yeah? When you have Alzheimer's disease or other diseases, your blood supply starts to get a bit ropey. Blood supply, more energy potential within the cell. So you get images like this, increased blood flow, the red indicating more. Okay, so that's what this therapy does. And that was actually the first thing our first paper actually demonstrated that it did that, and it did it quite selectively for that wavelength, more than the other wavelengths. Some wavelengths weren't so good, actually they went the other way, so we've avoided those over the years. Okay, so it's not all good news with light, generally. Okay, so other things. So it does that, which is great, but it's not all about that. Other things it does, it increases the energy. So this is your battery. In every new nerve cell you've got, every cell in your body actually, pretty much has mitochondria. It's your batteries that run all these cells. In the brain, you need a lot of mitochondria because the brain is pretty active. In fact, 30 or 40% of your oxygen supplies goes to the brain, really. The rest is for the rest of the body. So it's really important to have